I'm deeply grateful to you, Bob, for coming here this evening with me to introduce the talk. And as you'll see, I owe Bob and so many others of this community enormous debts. And I'm very grateful to Father Kaiser and to Tom Toddy for the opportunity to spend part of the evening with you. My journey to the school began in the spring of 1966 on a Saturday morning when my father told me that I was going to go from our home in Trenton on a long journey to a Jesuit high school in northwest Detroit to take an entrance exam. This didn't strike me as a good use of a Saturday morning, which ordinarily at that stage of my life was devoted to sleep. But I went along to humor my dad, and what I'd like to talk about tonight is how that experience and my connection with this community and the high school shaped my opportunities and my attitude toward the various endeavors that Bob just mentioned. That is, how did this factor into my professional life? First, and very importantly, is just a function of geography. My experience of coming here broadened my horizons and increased my acceptance for the notion that one's development requires leaving what is often called today the zone of personal comfort. And it requires, in order to grow, a willingness to depart from what is familiar, what would be easier to adapt, and to take on things that are very hard. My natural likely destination until this trip in the spring of '66 was to go to Trenton High School. We lived in Trenton. Trenton's about 25 miles away from this spot. Trenton High School was a 10-minute walk away from my house. That's where my friends went to school. That's where everyone in the community was headed. Those are the people I know. Those are the people in sport whom I competed with or were on the same team with. This was the habitat that was enormously familiar. As I discovered on that misbegotten journey to take the entrance exam, this is a 50-mile round trip from my house. 10-minute walk, 50-mile round trip. Now, I knew a little bit about Detroit. I'd been into the city. I knew J.L. Hudson's and the Christmas extravaganza. I knew the great respected shrine at Michigan and Trumbull, a sacred part of the earth. I knew the Olympia too, and I knew what it was like to watch Gordie Howe and to see the sign behind the net that said, "Jesus saves, but Howe scores on the rebound." And I knew as well what it was like to go to Cobo Arena in the days when the Pistons would play doubleheaders with teams from elsewhere in the NBA before they became the non-Detroit Pistons. Left the city. Maybe the prodigals will return someday. My first day at the high school further reinforced my notion that this was a gross mistake because I ultimately was part of a carpool, but the first day's trip was not. My dad took me to the bus stop. 2 buses later, I made my way up to the corner of Wyoming and 7 Mile, and I walked over. That was the start. That was a 2.5-hour trip, door to door, to get into school. The day was completely bewildering, filled with anxiety, completely alien environment, people I didn't know at all, the stomach-churning uncertainty. I remember well sitting down next to Keith Killow, who would ultimately be one of my classmates, and saying, "How are you doing? Where are you from?" I said, "I'm doing badly. I'm scared to death." That's how things are going so far. Then there was the journey home, which was all bus, 3 buses. The Wyoming through bus, down Wyoming, getting on the bus in front of the place that Eddie Murphy would later make famous, Mumford High School. Taking the bus all the way down to the intersection of Miller Road and West Jefferson, onto another bus into Trenton, and still onto another bus close to our home. I think the combination of just anxiety, fear, apprehension, fatigue, weariness, awful traffic took its toll. And I became increasingly nauseous, and to punctuate the day, I threw up right at the feet of the bus driver getting off. That was day 1. And I thought to myself, 4 years of this, right? Now, I knew that the carpool was on the horizon at some point, but I was completely drained, and I could do nothing more than to wash up, toss myself into bed. I skipped supper, horrifying my mother, who'd never seen me do that, and getting ready for the bell to ring the next day. But what was good about this? The journeys that Bob was describing, it obliterated my sense that there were limits. It pushed the frontiers way out. After a year, I was a master of the transit system in Detroit. It meant nothing to me to get on a bus out in front of the building to go downtown and meet my dad. There was nothing unusual about meeting friends at school to go to a debate tournament in Southfield, then to run across the city to watch a swimming meet in Oakland County, and then make my way back on the bus back to Trenton. The distances meant nothing anymore, and they mean nothing to me now. It's created a sense of excitement and interest in moving around, getting shoved way out of the zone of comfort, the little orbit around Trenton, Michigan, changed my attitude about what was possible and what to do, and gave myself just a little bit of confidence that it was possible to navigate in a very complex and large world. A second element of being brought out of the comfort zone was the larger socialization and learning about the city of Detroit. Trenton, Michigan was a city completely white. African Americans would come through Trenton on their way to McLeod Steel or to the Trenton factory for making engines for Chrysler, but that was it. Before coming to U of D High School, I knew no African Americans. I had never had anything other than a fragmentary conversation with the occasional adult whom I would meet with my parents on some trip across the country, but I knew none. Now at that time, fall of 1966, there were not lots of African Americans at this school. There were 3. But 3 was a lot greater than 0. And the 3 became acquaintances. And it was not simply the opportunity to meet them and talk to them, but it was to watch people I did not know at all who were completely alien do great work. And I'm convinced that there is no better way than to develop respect for others than to watch them do things that you admire. A good idea in the classroom, some great accomplishment in an extracurricular event. It is difficult to carry the baggage of earlier predispositions towards doubts and hesitation, or indeed bias, when you watch someone day in and day out do truly superior things. It's hard to withhold respect for that. And indeed, it was not simply the interaction with the small number of African Americans in school. I had to stand outside that bus stop on Wyoming. These were African American kids coming out of Mumford High School, probably finding my presence as odd as I did my own presence there. But riding the bus with lots of folks, meeting people from all over the city, a completely different environment. Needless to say, that prepared me for the life that I've gotten to live now, the larger environment in which I would live. That never would have happened at Trenton High School. Maybe that day would have come, but it would have been taking place much later. To live in this community, to see its complexity, variety, and tensions, by itself was an enormous education that simply came from a change in geography itself. Beyond the extension of borders, what else came to me that has been so valuable in working in our shared profession? The imposition of high standards. The demand that came from having high standards for performance. This was an extremely demanding, and still is, intellectual environment. The classroom experience is intense. The person who scared me the most in my first 2 years was George Tolbert. George taught me. Getting into the first class, I thought, all right, I've taken the bus ride, I'm here, what's the beginning going to be like? Surely there's some long, gradual warm-up so that we get ready in the first few days. George Tolbert said, okay, let's go, we're going to start now. I'm going to start telling you something. Every day there will be a quiz, and tomorrow will be the first one. Collected the quizzes, and on day 3, Now I'm going to give them back to you. He walked up to George Shakespeare. These were on a little half sheet of paper. 5 questions, 5 answers, and on the top was written 100. He flipped it to George and said, "Good job, keep up the good work." And then there were the rest of us. And he went down through the aisles saying, "Trash, garbage, insufficient." And he looked at me and said, "I hope you'll be able to do better than this or you will not survive," and flicks the piece of paper. And I thought, my God, what is it? On the top was written 95. What was George's point? Again and again. And it took about a year before at that time of the day my stomach did not start to constrict from the nervousness of walking in there. His basic point was, I'm trying to acquaint you with the standard you'll have to meet to succeed in the future. And he said, I won't be there berating you to do better. It must come from within. And the sooner you learn that that's the standard of performance, the better off you will be. It wasn't the most pleasant way to absorb the lesson, but to be sure, he was right. He was precisely right about that. And as a professional lesson over time, as you all know, it quickly comes the moment where no one's looking over your shoulder. It must come from within. Not only did he set high standards, but others did too. I had a sense that my instructors were very good then. I know how good they are now, having been in the classroom since 1986. I know how good they were as pedagogues. They were exceptional. This was an undergraduate quality faculty in so many ways. We were taught by people who in the ordinary course easily could have been on college faculties. I'll give you 2 exemplars, and in picking them out, I am doing disservice to the many others who were in the highest caliber. Richard Polakowski and Fred McGinnis. Polakowski was exceptional in his capacity to put together a class, as was Fred McGinnis. Pacing, variety, preparation. There was absolutely nothing accidental about it. It was all the product of extraordinary work day in and day out to craft something that was different and good. And God, I know it now. Because you go and do it and try and do that day in and day out, and he was doing several iterations a day, is an incredibly demanding thing. And to keep it at the highest level so that so often you walked out of the room saying, that's a good class. Now that was a great class. Was enormously striking Fred the same. I know now none of that happened by chance. That was by design. In a separate setting, I came to learn just how people who make it look natural work so hard to make it work. When I was an undergraduate, I was a sports writer for a while. And one day I went to interview the #1 player on the women's tennis team, Marjorie Gengler. She had been very successful, and I went to meet her, and I saw that she was talking to a very tall guy whom I'd seen before. I didn't know it, but this was her fiancé, Stan Smith. Stan Smith, several Grand Slam titles, exceptionally good tennis player. Now she is Mrs. Stan Smith. But at the time they were engaged. I met him, and I was fumbling around to say hello, and with nervousness and awkwardness, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind is, I love your tennis, you have such a natural backstroke. And he scowled at me. I thought this was a suitable compliment from a bumbling 19-year-old kid. He said, what do you mean natural? I said, well, it just looks so smooth. And he says, are you doing anything tomorrow? This is a Saturday. I said, yeah, that's Sunday. He said, 8 o'clock, down in the clay courts, be there. 8 o'clock on Sunday was not my favorite time of day as an undergraduate, but there I was. And for the next 2 hours, I watched him back and forth on the baseline. Slice, topspin, lob, driving backhand, feet moving all the time with a team of the men's singles players at the university hitting against him. After 2 hours, he walks up and says, that's what makes it natural. It doesn't just happen. That makes it natural. That's what made it natural for Polakowski and McGinnis. I go back now and stare with ever greater amazement at what they did. It's made me, as I look back, a much better teacher. Here are a few precepts that I derive from watching them work. First, if you work hard as an instructor, your students will give you the benefit of the doubt. If they see that you're pressing to do their best, they will respect that. And I suspect that's true with clients and the relationship with lawyers. If they see you taking the extra measure and step, they don't expect you to be omniscient. They do expect you to make the full commitment, to put yourself in their shoes and to understand what they do. Another thing that Polakowski was famous for in particular is he would say, and I remembered saying, never bluff. I asked him at the time I was thinking the teacher, never bluff. If you don't know, say no. And many of you are familiar with Polakowski's tendency to put thoughts into 3 baskets. He said, during your lifetime, you should make clear that some things go in the basket called what you know, a second basket called what you believe, and a third basket called what you don't know. Make sure you are absolutely clear-headed about what goes in which basket. And don't make it up if it's not in the first basket. It's fair enough to say, I don't know, and I'll try to find out. And over a lifetime, yes, you try to move more things from the don't know and believe basket into the known basket. That will make you better off over time. The second thing he pointed out in particular, in this respect, he was not like George Tolbert. Polakowski said in the classroom, praise lavishly in public, criticize quietly and privately. Never show somebody up in the classroom. When you criticize, honest, direct, constructive, the whole point is to make them better. But that happens in a private moment on the side. You don't do that in front of the room to show everybody up. And he said, you have a chance each hour, day in and day out, because you don't know how many you'll have, to paint a masterpiece. What are you going to do today in this hour to make it memorable so that people will say, that was a great class? And remember, in your interaction with students, and it's so true, in ways you will never imagine, you have a deep influence in how they see themselves and how they think. Each moment, each day, that's the role you play as an instructor. I can't think of better preparation to teach. All of these guys were so good. And to thank both of them now, the belated Dick Polakowski in particular, thank you for that. Enormously, enormously informative and so true. A third thing that was so valuable to me from being here that I've learned and is useful for the future is something about how to be a good leader. And let me mention 2 other very different people I knew here on our faculty who did that. John Tenbush and Pat Mcduck. Not exactly peas in a pod in the way in which they went about their jobs. John Tenbush, whom I saw a lot in the track and field side of his life, did a number of things that Bob was referring to before that so much influenced the way I think. First, team orientation first. John would tell everyone on the team that the essence of success is collective accomplishment, not individual achievement. And the metaphor he would focus on is the relay. He'd say, you notice in the relay, individual initiative is extremely important. You have to run your leg very well. But if you run a brilliant leg and you don't pass that stick at the right time, in the right place, it's going to be a failure. So each of you must do your best, but you do it as a collective. And if there's no cooperation and coordination at key junctures, you will fail. And in a number of instances, and this also reflected on the quality of student here, he would go to a superb athlete and say, I want you to get out of your best event, and I want you to specialize in other events, because we will get more points in the finals if you run in these other events than if you run in your best event. I remember how he went to Gary Hornvetz. Some of you might remember Gary. Gary was a brilliant sprinter. He ran it extremely well. He was highly competitive. He's the kind of guy who could score at the state level in that race. John Tenbush went to him and said, "I'd like you to run the sprints instead. I think you can run a really good 100 and a 220. And if you do that well, that's more points than if you excel in the 440. And I'm asking you to do it, even though it means your individual achievements will suffer for this part of the season." And Gary said, "I'll do it." Now, part of what John did was very good at persuasion. He said this is why. He made clear to the members of his team why he was imposing these demands and requests. But in so many instances, they didn't. One other thought about leadership and management in that position was that John made clear to the members of the team that my job is not to be your best friend. Not as the coach. I'm not your best friend. I remember one occasion where he was pressing people through a particularly hard workout, and they were moaning about it. And he said, "Guys, how would you like it if I told you to just take the week off? Maybe 1 or 2 times around the track. How do you think we're going to do at the end of the year? How much will you like me when we win nothing? When we place way out of the standings? My job is to press you to do things you don't want to do, but to explain to you why that's important. So my job is not always to tell you what you want to hear, it's what you need to know and how you're going to be better over time." Pat Mcduck, not quite like John Tenbush, but what did I learn so well from Pat Mcduck? Mcduck had lots of exercises that forced you to go and listen. One of his favorites was, "I want you to go to a city block in downtown Detroit, and I want you to go and interview people in each establishment and write basically a demographic profile, little story about that block. And the only way you're going to do it is go talk to everybody." I thought, what? 17 years old, I go pick out a block and I'm going to walk through it? My assigned block had a police station, it had a liquor store, it had a methadone maintenance clinic. This was not the most exalted gentry of the city of Detroit. It was a rough neighborhood. But in going in and talking to people and just listening, Pat's advice was, listen. Your job is to listen and write. Ask questions, listen. And by doing that, you'll learn. And his other advice about leadership is that you have to press yourself to continue to improve. Pat, as you know, was a tennis player. Pat liked playing tennis. And you would have thought that the seemingly rotund man could not move around. But those thin little legs could move around the court quite well. Pat was a pretty good tennis player. And his advice on trying to raise your game was, he said, no tennis player ever got better by playing weaker tennis players. The only way you're going to improve is to put yourself in a setting in which you're dealing with better, smarter, tougher, faster people than you are, and trying to emulate that. And that brings me, with respect to leadership and learning, to the students I knew here. As I look back now, I had a sense of this at the time. Indeed, when I came here as a student, I was intimidated by the intellectual skills of my fellow students here. I was struck at how, in so many instances, students I had here would discover in 5 minutes something I was proud that I'd figured out in a week. And they got it right away. It was remarkable to be in the midst of such a formidable collection of skills, even though there are a number of my classmates who pretended they didn't have them, but they did. And every so often, despite their efforts to suppress what they knew, out would bubble the real stream of knowledge that they had and their analytical ability. It was stunning day in and day out. But one of the lessons from this is take nothing for granted. There are a lot of smart folks out there. And the only way to stay up would be to run very hard and try very hard. That was, again, the quality and standard that you'd have to satisfy. And I don't know from day in and day out, in ways that I can't even recount, how much I absorbed and borrowed from friends who are in the room now. People I'd spend lots of days from, ways in which knowledge of all sorts just seeped into my veins because I had the opportunity to stay with a group that was so superior. And certainly a lesson for me over time was you want to surround yourself with people like that in life. That's where you want to work. You want to work with people who have those kinds of skills and abilities, because that will lift your game, especially if you have the chance to have a management position in an institution of different kinds. Let me finish with a following lesson that has elements of spirituality, it has elements of simply pragmatism and professional development. I'd say what I carried away from school as well was a much deeper understanding of human experience generally, and its link to what is called in the Apostles' Creed, the life of the world to come. If you go to the Catholic Mass, the literature, it's one of the last words of the Creed. I look forward to the life of the world to come. What does that mean? And here I turn to Father Farrell. Not a flamboyant teacher. Sometimes after lunch, kind of dry. And in the occasionally overheated classrooms that you had in the upper floors, heavy lunch, somewhat languid teaching style, mid-afternoon, formula for a little bit of slumber now and then. But as I reflect back, and I've had a chance from time to time to go back and look at my notes, Farrell was the thinking person's introduction to theology and, in many ways, insight into the human spirit. One of the points he would make, which by the way was made by so many other instructors, is, all of you guys, you're the favored few. The amount of DNA with smarts in it is randomly distributed around the world, and how fortunate you are to have gotten a substantial share. And that was certainly true of everyone that was sitting in this building. It was a remarkably talented group of people. And the question he posed is, how are you going to use it? Well, first, don't be boastful. Be humble, be magnanimous. I don't want to see you thumping your chest. That's not the way to do it. But that is not an admonition not to use the talents. I can recall one of his favorite stories is the famous story of the talents. You may recall. One guy gets 10, another gets 5, another gets 2. 10 and 5 go out and double what they have. 2 is scared, buries it, and comes back to the master and say, here are your 2 back. Who gets a real thrashing in that story? You know, it's the last guy. Because the master says, I gave you the talents to use, and you hid them. You buried them. And there is the further passage that says, don't put the talents under a bushel basket. Your moral obligation, having been given these gifts, is to go use them productively and for good purposes. That's part of your job. I remember him saying at one point that, heaven, in many ways, is going to be the realization of a full life's potential. The effort to give complete expression to all of one's capabilities in one's job and in other areas of endeavor. And he said at the same time, it's not altogether clear that hell is a big fiery pit with guys dressed up in red costumes, carrying pitchforks and blowtorches, carrying a route and chasing the afflicted for eternity. He said it's entirely possible that hell is the state of mind that comes from the awareness of unfulfilled possibilities. Talents buried and not used. An eternity of awareness, of capabilities, of possibilities foregone. Out of fear, out of doubt, a lack of resolution, a lack of commitment. He said, that's the big tragedy in life. And how sad it would be to spend forever, which is a long time. Longer than a faculty meeting, longer than a partnership meeting, longer than just a bad seminar. Forever is a long period of time. How awful it would be to be able to spend all of that time compelled to reflecting on the failure to take each moment, each day, each capability, and not using them to the fullest. He said, that's the big disappointment. And the moral dimension of having the great skills and abilities is to use them fruitfully, productively, thoughtfully. So, where does the high school fit in? And in doing this, I didn't go back and look at all my notes, my yearbooks. in a way that would be artificially trying to construct what this experience meant. I simply sat down and thought, what is it about what I've been able to do that I can link back, indeed must attribute to my experience here? All of these things. And as a result, I regard this couple of city blocks as being one of the most precious places on earth. And if you look at lots of institutions across the span of human experience, it's hard to find one that delivers day in and day out on the promise of turning individuals and their skills into the prospect of a better world. How does it rank? Years ago, I read an interview with the curator of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, and the journalist who interviewed him said, "Does the Hermitage have the best collection of art in the world?" And he said, "Well, that's a hard question. There are so many good ones. There's the Prada in Madrid, there's the Louvre in Paris. There's so many great restaurants, so many great museums, and great restaurants." But I can tell you this, we are not the second. And if you ask, how's U of D High School, U of D Jesuit doing, it is not the second. Thank you.